In my previous video, I mounted the 3040 extension kit onto my 3018 CNC. As my CNC grew bigger, I needed a new enclosure. And while I was at it, why not make a few improvements as well? Welcome to the cellar. I am a cellar nerd, my name is Frederick, and now let's see how I built this thing. The construction itself is rather simple. I decided to go for a plain box, so I needed 6 sides of plywood. For the base and the 4 walls I'm using 12mm thick plywood, that's about ½ inch. But I had to use 6mm or 1/4 inch plywood for the top as I ran out of 12mm plywood. I figured out the dimensions as I was progressing. The depth of the enclosure is equal to the width of the CNC plus a little bit of wiggle room. To find the proper width, I had to take into account the movement of the bed, so I ran it all the way front and all the way back, and added a little bit for good measure. The height is given by the place where my CNC resides, and as you'll see later on, I pretty much maxed it out in all 3 dimensions. There's barely a millimeter to spare in there. The box is held together using glue and some brad nails as clamping pressure while the glue sets. As I used 6mm plywood for the top piece, I chose to reinforce the front with a strip of 12mm plywood before fastening the piano hinge for the front, or the door if you like. Once it's all assembled, it's time to see if my measurements are on point. Like I said, not a millimeter to spare in there. To make the spoil board, I took the only kind of MDF I have, panel boards left over from when the living room was refinished. There are 3 Home Depot-like stores in town, but none of them carry regular MDF boards. But the wall panels are 12mm thick and do a decent enough job as spoil boards once they are flattened. I cut it to size and add holes to mount it on the bed, using 3D printed T-nuts to attach it. Then it's time to flatten it, using a 13mm surface bit. The spoil board is still a bit too big, so the CNC is pushed around a bit inside, but I cut it again after it's been finished. I make a hole in the short end of the enclosure to mount the controller board on the outside, getting it out of the way of dust and debris. Then I drill some holes to fasten the CNC, and I add 3D printed shims printed in flexible TPU to dampen the sounds a bit. Add the TPU feet to the enclosure as well, and we are done with all the major parts. As I'll be using this CNC both as a CNC router and with a diode laser, I have chosen not to add a window. If I had not been using a laser, I would have made an opening here for a piece of acrylic. But instead, I made a hole back here to mount a webcam. That way, I can see what's going on even with the lid closed. And as you can see, I've added some LEDs back here to give me some light to actually be able to see what's on the webcam feed. The CNC is controlled by CNCjs using a Raspberry Pi. The Pi is not mounted, but it resides on top here. That's because when I use the diode laser, I like to use light burn, and then I need to remove the USB cable from the Raspberry Pi and mount it on my Mac. With the Pi, the LEDs and the camera mounted, it's working perfectly. Now my next step is to make a mount for my diode laser, but that's another story for another video. If you have watched this far, I really appreciate it. Do consider subscribing, leave me a thumbs up, and if you got comments or questions, please feel free. The comments are right down below. Yeah.